Okay, so welcome. Joe and I are going to talk about politics. That's the idea of this show. Joe, do you want to say a bit about who you are? Introduce yourself.
Well, we're woke warriors, obviously.
Yeah.
Somewhat ironic nod to sort of some of the discourse that we're seeing at the moment. I'm Joe. I've been teaching history for 12 years. I also teach critical thinking, and I think for me the impetus to do this has come out of talking with you, James, and more sort of widely having to think through pretty much all of the assumptions I made about politics from the ages of, from when I first became interested in politics right up to a couple of years ago. I basically had a very fixed set of assumptions that sort of stood me well, if you like, and which have essentially kind of collapsed over the past couple of years. So that's my motive for kind of wanting to have these discussions.
Yeah. So and I'm James, as you said, and similarly, I think maybe at different times, and maybe more gradually in my case, there's been a shift to the left. So if you go back to like 2010, I was a ardent Thatcherite. I would now describe myself as a democratic socialist, and so my politics has shifted as dramatically as it possibly could over just a decade, little over a decade, and I thought that could be what we start with. So, I don't know whether your shift started as early as mine. So I guess mine was triggered by, if you're a Thatcherite, the reason you're a Thatcherite is because you want the state to be small, you want individuals to be free, and back when I was naive, as I now view it, I felt that there was a principled argument for that position, and then I lived through austerity for a few years, and it was just immediately obvious that was complete nonsense. And then gradually over time I came to realize like a whole bunch of other stuff. But I guess if you were never that far to the right, then austerity might have sort of, I wouldn't say washed over you, but it wouldn't have challenged you as much as it did me.
Yeah, so I think for me, something I have been writing about today, thinking about today, is that I think the interesting difference between you and me, James, is I think you come at politics in quite from a framework of ideas. What do I believe about the economy? What do I believe about politics and the organization of society? Whereas I think when I was coming at politics as a young man, sort of in the 2000s and early 2010s, I came at it much more as, if I'm honest, as a kind of game show. I came at it the way politics is discussed in contemporary society, which is sort of like, which of these big name performers, whose team are you on? And who's got the best strategy? Who's the best player of the game? Whose suit looks sharpest? Who's got the best rhetorical technique? And I think I learned, and I think this is something that is symptomatic of actually how the political consensus has operated over the past 20, 30, 40 years. I learned really a mode of political interaction, if you like, which was essentially, I think now, looking at it from my perspective now, essentially kind of empty of content. Like, I don't think there was much substance to it if I look back. I don't know if I did have very many really deeply held political beliefs.
And I don't usually press you on this, but is that not doing yourself a disservice? I mean, I went through a phase of that where I would have described myself as a Blairite. I wouldn't describe that phase as contentless. I mean, if I was to outline what I believed, it would be that a moderate left platform, although I probably, I might not describe it like that now, where you increase public services, where you try and make people's lives better through modest social change, that if that's all you can manage, because it comes back to, can you win an election? And that's the sort of, that for me is the difference between somebody that's on the left of the Labour Party and somebody who's on the right. Somebody on the right, winning the election is paramount, and it's almost like, you know, what you do once you're in power is secondary to that. Like anything can go as long as you can win power, and you know, you might get to a point, and I don't think I'm as cynical as you about this, but you might get to a point where you win power, and maybe this is what the early Blairs felt like a little bit. You win power, and then you go, well now what? I don't think it is that empty. I think you're doing I think you're doing yourself a disservice. I think you're doing sort of like that vein of politics disservice.
Yeah, no, but I think you slightly misunderstand me actually. So I can certainly see that there was political content in Blair's attempt to essentially adapt the Thatcherite consensus, as I would see it, monetarism, and, you know, neoliberalism, if you want to use that phrase, to adapt that consensus towards sort of like very modest centre-left aims, right? But there was intellectual content to that, in the sense that, you know, achieving the goals of the left wasn't something that could be done through the traditional approaches that the left had taken in the past. A new approach was needed, and there was clear, you know, there was a clear mandate for that within the Labour Party in the 1990s. I think I'm very much describing my own engagement with politics, yeah, when I did well, and I think it is more accurate. I think listen, when I talked about politics, when I thought about it, I wouldn't have put it in those terms at the time. But what strikes me looking back now is how malleable those positions were. So, you know, why I mean, this is sort of like awful to acknowledge this really, but obviously, you know, at the time of it, I was only 18, 19 years old. I would sort of vocally supported the Iraq War. Now, why did I do that, right? I guess I would have said because it was about regime change, and that was good because Saddam Hussein was an evil dictator, and etc. But essentially, if I'm honest, if Tony Blair hadn't taken that position, I don't think I would have done either. And I think that's quite difficult when you sort of face that reality. You know, it's sort of like, I didn't want to tell myself that, but that is the truth. You know, in that sense, my politics was really malleable according to whether or not the group of sort of politicians that I deemed to be within the kind of, if you like, the sensible consensus of politics, as I like to think of it, the ones who are deemed by media commentators as grown-up, serious politicians, if those guys were saying something was a good idea, then I could be encouraged to believe it. If they weren't, I was very unlikely to support it. And that's what I mean, really. There wasn't much ideological substance behind that. And the result of that was I was just pushed incrementally to the right, because essentially there were no core principles anchoring me anywhere. And it was sort of like, well, if you go down this route of electability, and by the way, of course, I think the Labour right are wrong about the idea that their approach to the current situation is one that will ensure electability for the Labour Party. I think they're completely wrong about that, and that's something we can expand on. But you know, even at the time where that was maybe more of a valid viewpoint, I still think what the ultimate effect of it was to basically empty out the content of centre-left politics and to make it a kind of endless triangulation, where as you describe it, winning becomes the justification for policy. And so in that sense, anything can be justified. You picked a
really strange example to illustrate your point, in the sense that, you know, if you think about Blair and you think about that period,
yeah,
if you were going to say that Blair believed anything, it was he believed in his foreign policy. He believed, you know, in this almost messianic mission that he had in his own mind to, you know, it was never about, for me, looking at Blair in that period, it was never really about weapons of mass destruction. For him, it was there was a moral case for regime change. It had worked in Sierra Leone, it worked in Kosovo, it was going to work in Iraq. And, you know, he believed that, you know, whatever happened to him politically, because I think he knew when he went into that, It's an odd position. It's not what I'd like to admit publicly, but there we go. But I actually admire Blair for his stance on Iraq, unlike most people on the left, because, you know, even though I now regard it as being a massive mistake, I admire the fact that it was a principled position that he took, that he knew would be politically unpopular. And most people on the left don't see it like that. But I have not changed my mind about that in relation to Blair. So I think, anyway, I'm taking us off on a tangent with that.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, your substantive point is that for you, your sort of version of right-wing Labour politics was fairly contentless. I guess I never felt like that because I'd moved from the right, and so, you know, there was still a sort of belief. It was a sort of gradual movement for me. So there was always a little bit of content left from my days as a Thatcherite, and then it kind of blended with some left-wing ideas, and then gradually, you know, it just shifted. And so there was always content there, as you said, driven by the ideas.
Yeah, that's the difference that I see between you and me.
But the other thing about the foreign policy stuff is there's something else behind that, isn't there? If you're on the left, you're just going to look at the Iraq War differently because your whole analysis of what politics is about is different. Because you're going to see the world in terms of power. You're going to see the world in terms of who has that power, how it's exercised, for what purpose. You're going to see the world more in terms of dominant discourses and less dominant discourses. And so when you look at something like the Iraq War, from a left perspective, you're seeing it as, you know, a kind of colonial project, you know, a kind of assertion of an assertion of power in a really negative way. Because whereas if you're not on the left, you can you're in a different modality, in a different framework. You might be more inclined to see American power as good.
Right, but it's not a different view, is it? I think it is an important distinction. You know, the architects of the American invasion of Iraq absolutely saw it as a colonial exercise. You know, they were quite clear about that. Like, this is the new American century. You know, this is America kind of establishing its dominance over key spheres of influence.
Right, but I guess my point is you can wrap that up.
Well, I just finished that, James. Sorry, and you can come back in.
We can't do that, Joe. We can't.
I think we've got to be a bit spiky. I think there's got to be a bit of spikiness in there, and I think this one is a really good topic because what you're saying about Blair, I think even what you've said, and this is an area where you and I, probably there still is a decent gulf between us. I think even what you just said is still part of the Blair mythology. Okay, so was there an idealistic component to what he did? Well, I mean, on the one hand, as you've just said rightly, it seems to break with the Blairite mode of politics. So what was going on there? Well, one answer to me is simply, this was an attempt by Tony Blair to give his politics some content. This was essentially one area, foreign policy, where he had the freedom to act in a much more, if you like, presidential or a much freer hand in his decision making. And I think there was an element of essentially forming the ideological component to it on the go. There isn't really a good foreign policy justification for the invasion of Iraq.
Right, but I guess my point is that you can wrap that you can wrap that up in an ideology, can't you? So which you can't if you're on the left. So for example, in the American context, there's always been this discourse about America, this sort of imagined version of America, that America is the empire of freedom. I can't remember where that quotation is from. It's from one of the early founding fathers. And similarly, if you're British, there's an imagined version of Britain where we're the good guys. And of course, that is a position that you can only possibly sustain if from a certain perspective, right? You can't sustain it if for a second if you think about Ireland, for example, or if you think about any other part of the British Empire, practically.
Yeah, or Vietnam in relation to...
And so that's my point about not being on the left, right? So if you're on the left, you're going to see politics from the perspective of the other. You're going to see politics from the perspective of those that we oppressed. So you're not going to be able to buy into this idea of America and Britain as the world's savior, because those discourses, whilst powerful from a different perspective, I bought into them at the time, right? When I was on the right, I thought, yes, we need to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's the bad guy. Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a neo-colonial project. We'll be in there for the long haul, but colonialism in the past has been bad. This can be a different version of colonialism in a way that's good. And I genuinely thought that.
Exportation, democracy. Yeah. Well, look, and of course there were writers, weren't there, who are still active now. People like Nick Cohen, Christopher Hitchens, yeah. And various others who were making exactly this case, right? That it was essentially this was a war against fascism. That was quite influential on me at the time. But I think I just come back to the point I made before, which why I see that episode as still representing the fundamental flaw, if you like, of the kind of reconceptualization of the centre left that happened in the Blair era, because I think it was trying to give substance where there wasn't really substance. There was a lot of almost revisionism of the process of in terms of what was actually happening, and then an attempt to establish an ideological framework for that on the go. And also I think, again, that point about it happening in the realm of foreign policy, I think you have to come back to this idea that this is when I think we get to the nub of it. The fundamental conception of politics in my adult life has been really that politics is kind of over. Politics ended in the late 1980s, ended certainly with the end of the Cold War, that there would be mild differences between those who argued for a bit more redistribution of wealth or higher public spending, or maybe a bit less. Essentially, there wouldn't be the big ideological gulf anymore between the left and the right. That was basically dead. And that meant really the only sphere of politics where any kind of ideological framework could be adopted was in the realm of foreign policy. And for someone like Blair, who does have that messianic quality that you touch on, which he kind of channeled really well as a campaigner, right? That was a huge part of his appeal, as and driving him towards that landslide victory in 1997, which then, of course, in practice, he doesn't really use. It's probably a subject for another occasion, but the potential of that landslide victory in terms of what's actually delivered. Yeah, of course, there are some achievements, there are some important changes that are made in real people's lives. I don't think we should ignore, but at the same time, it doesn't fulfill the potential that was given by that great majority in 97. But in foreign policy, I think there was an opportunity to kind of recast the Blairite project as a genuinely transformative one. And I think it was, that had terrible consequences, for millions of real people living in Iraq, and to some extent also in Afghanistan.
I think it's interesting that we've naturally ended up talking about Iraq. It's kind of not where I expected this to go at all.
No, nor me.
But there is a Peter Hennessy, the historian, who we'll both be familiar with. He talks about political generations, and his thesis is that each generation is defined by an event. And I think for our generation, it probably is September the 11th and ultimately what position we took on the Iraq War. And I know in my case that if I was to pinpoint a moment where I went from being a sort of fairly unthinking sixth form student, like not really that engaged in politics, probably definitely on the left, but not really knowing why I was on the left. And then the Iraq War happened, and then suddenly I was like, oh, okay, I'm agreeing with Dick Cheney. And then I sort of moved to the right, and then just stayed there until something else happened that again shook my convictions. And I think that's quite interesting. That's just that and it makes me think, well, what does that look like for this political generation? What did it look like for previous political generations? And can that help? And again, it's probably a topic for a future podcast, but can that idea help us to think about, well, why do we have the divide in our politics that we currently do between, I would say that the divide, and again, we'll get this probably at a future point, is about conceptualizations of who we are and where we've come from, so, and therefore where we're going.
Yeah, I was just going to echo really how you just characterized the Iraq War as a sort of, I think more so than 9/11 actually, as a moment of political awakening for probably a whole generation. Probably everybody my age, or lots and lots of people my age. That was the first moment of real political awareness. And I think for me, as an 18-year-old who was kind of desperate, I think, to be regarded as the sensible one. I had a mother who was kind of very, very kind of knee-jerk left, very unthinking left positions. Still doesn't really understand the basis of the positions that she holds. I think there was a natural kind of, I kind of kicked against that, and I saw this as an opportunity to sort of, I reached for this, what I saw as this kind of adult, grown-up version of politics, where you roll your sleeves up and you accept that, there are tough consequences, but you have to, and of course it was also incredibly Western centric. It was sort of like, well, we have to make these tough decisions, for the benefit of them, like these poor Iraqis, they're these sort of benighted people, we the responsible grown-up West have to go and sort of sort it all out. It really is the white man's burden, just 100 years on. I mean, let's be honest about that, I think.
But these discourses are problematic as well, aren't they? I mean, we can sort of say that, but at the same time, we didn't intervene in Rwanda. There were people in Iraq calling for us to intervene. The Kurds, for example, in the north, the Marshall Arabs in the south. It's not like it was entirely a sort of imposed upon the country. There were people, and I don't want to return to those debates.
No, I don't think we should relitigate it.
I think to view it as a sort of entirely as a imposition of Western force isn't quite right. However, it gets to a lot of the truth. I mean, I was struck by what you just said about the wanting to reject a sort of knee-jerk leftism, and I remember at the time feeling something that I haven't changed my mind about again, which is that the sort of the politics on the left at the time felt quite sloganized and quite sort of lazy almost. Like you had the no war for oil, not in my name sort of stuff going on. And I just thought, well, that doesn't really make sense. It still doesn't make sense to me. Like if we were invading Iraq, even if it was a sort of imperialist project, is it just about oil? It was kind of like, I just found that whole narrative very, very sloppy and reductive and quite easy to argue against. And then you just sort of end up in a position where you're with Christopher Hitchens and others on that side of the debate. But should we move on from this? Because otherwise we're going to get stuck on.
Yeah, I think I'll say one more thing about it, but I mean, it's only really echoing what you've said. I think the two things one thing which I think will help us later on really is to say, it's interesting, isn't it? I was similar to you. I regarded the positions that the left took, the anti-war movement, as being quite simplistic. But what really fascinates me looking back now is just to think, my goodness, we went to war in Iraq. We're so used to that now. We just acknowledge that as a thing that happened. It's quite an extraordinarily destructive and unnecessary act of aggression. Yes, you're right. There were elements within Iraq who wanted some form of intervention, although I don't think the form that eventually manifested worked in anyone's interest really. But I just think it's so easy in a way to sort of scorn the kind of like, as you said, and I have the same position, right? The sloganizing and the virtue signaling, which is a phrase you come across quite a lot if you hold left positions, and it's kind of like, well, no, actually, I mean, there were principles that were worth defending in 2003 in opposition to the Iraq War, and I think it's true to say the people who held those positions have been vindicated. Sometimes the simple answer is the right one. And what I find really interesting is isn't it fascinating that that we regard kind of someone like Jeremy Corbyn as naive on foreign policy. That's the sort of typical line that you'll hear. And we don't regard Tony Blair as naive on foreign policy. Here is a man who almost by his own admission was willing to initiate a conflict in which, as far as I know, around I think millions or hundreds of thousands of people have died. For relatively vague and undefined aims, and which have caused enormous instability in the country that's still living with the consequences of it today. They spread throughout the whole region, in fact. I find that really interesting, and I find it interesting who sets the terms of that debate, who decides who the naive dreamers are and who the kind of cold-eyed realists are in politics. Because I think that's where I've really shifted my view. Is like, it's not so much that I am, I've decided to become a naive dreamer. It's more that I've decided the naive dreamers are the people who kind of occupy what tends to be sort of generally discussed as the center ground of politics, who just sort of have this view that essentially the status quo of politics is basically fine. And we can just generally explain away the kind of the decisions that leaders take, whatever consequences they might have, initiating war,
part of what was happening then was that there was a discourse on the left that we weren't seeing. Because we were reading The Guardian, we were reading the Times and the Telegraph, or whatever we were reading at the time, and we were hearing what the media presented to us.
Absolutely.
And that was the confines of the debate. And of course, at the time, there would have been a debate on the left, which Hitchens would have been part of, because that was his circle, with people like Tariq Ali, for example. I remember hearing a little bit from at the time. But there would have been a whole discourse on the left that was much more sophisticated than I'm giving credit to. That, as you say, was very principled. But getting access to that in an age where media was much more controlled than it is, it's so controlled. But when you don't have social media, would have been, were you at the right dinner party?
I would say it was much more one-dimensional.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think,
and maybe that's part of what's going on when maybe that's part of what's just a move on to the next topic. Move on to the thing. Maybe that's part of the reason why there's been a shift to the left, because and I know that this is true in your case, that you can go on social media, that you can watch voices that you wouldn't have been able to engage with at all in a previous political era.
Yeah, so I think I really want to pick up on that, because it's getting to the heart of things I want to talk about here, which is you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. I know those discussions were happening now because I've gone back and read them. I've gone back and found some of those debates that were happening at the time, and it's exactly right. My conception of this very simplistic, naive leftist view of the Middle East or foreign policy, or it has just been, destroyed. It's like, it's obvious to me now that there was a much more intellectually substantive discussion of the real dangers of intervening in Iraq than was ever given widespread currency within the kind of mainstream media, if you want to use that expression. And I think that has been, for me, the major turning point. I think over the course of the past year, I've had lots of questions about how our politics has turned out, how we've ended up with a prime minister who, even long before the coronavirus crisis hit, I regarded as profoundly unsuitable for any office at all, let alone the highest office in the land. And that drew me towards first kind of left Twitter and then independent media, and it was like the back of my head just blowing off. It was this sudden realization that this whole sphere of political debate that I had essentially just written off as this kind of childlike, naive, posturing, virtue signaling, backslapping, cliche-ridden, finger pointing type of politics, which totally at odds with any kind of serious or sensible discussion. What I discovered instead was the quality of analysis that was going on, even on mainstream independent left platforms like, you know, like Novara, was just a different quality entirely to the, you know, to when I was listening to Radio 4, you know, when I was listening to the Today program. And I think what I find fascinating, again, something to return to, and, you know, we can definitely segue here, but I think what I would want to sort of just flag up is the idea that we've got so used in this country as a citizenry to being spoken to like children. We've got so used to our journalists kind of vaguely patronizing people about what you know, how they can understand things, sort of packaging things up in ways that simplify kind of core issues and remove the nuance from them in order to make them sort of palatable, and politicians just, you know, producing kind of utterly bland
well, and even academics have got to that point a little bit. I mean, I hate to bring up Matt Goodwin this early in our discussions, but I often think that academics like him, and I did read his book, and at the time, actually, I quite enjoyed it and thought it was insightful. And probably, if I reread it, I'd find some insight in it. But there is a sort of tendency, even amongst academics, to say, oh well, you know, we mustn't go left on cultural issues, otherwise these sort of red wall voters, they'll be, you know, and you end up with this sort of conception of what a red wall looks like that's totally devoid of any nuance whatsoever. You know, you've just got a sort of weird caricature of in my mind, it's sort of like a weird caricature of a sort of very northern working class bloke who probably works in an industry that doesn't even exist anymore. That, you know, likes to fly his English flag outside his house or whatever. You know, it's a ridiculous caricature of what the working class are like and what they care about, and is so destructive when you've got mainstream. You know, because if you want to have a conversation about electoral politics, you know, you've almost got to talk about this thing, the red wall. And unfortunately, bound up in that is this, you know, ridiculous caricature of what a red wall looks like. And it's similar with Brexit. You know, this idea of the sort of typical Brexit voter as being a similar sort of niche, when actually, in both cases, actually, our politics is driven by age first and foremost, and therefore these ideas about class being a driver of our politics are just totally wrong. They belong to a different era, which is why, you know, they don't really map onto what's going on, and why it might be a good idea to think about, first of all, political generations, and secondly, what the social conditions look like for different classes within society, with different ages within society, in terms of how we experience the world.
Yeah, well, I'm conscious I'm talking to somebody who, you know, grew up in I think a red wall seat.
I don't. Well, actually, I think it's one of the few that hasn't swung.
Okay.
It's still Labour. I think it will
Narrowly potentially
probably remain Labour. But my dad worked at Sedgefield District Council, which was, of course, Blair's seat, which did swing at the last election, as did many places around there.
Yeah, one just little isolated example of how the red wall is conceptualized that really struck a chord with me. Actually, they did I forget who, it's been ITV or the BBC, I can't remember. There was basically a little segment, of a clipped segment on the news of Vox Pops, somebody going round a northern town that I think I'm right in saying it was a red wall town. It voted for the Conservative Party in 2019, having previously been Labour. And what really struck me about it, all of the 6 people they interviewed were men. All of them were white men. All of them were older. They were either sort of, you know, 40 or going up to pensioner age. And it struck me that was, nobody would have quibbled with that. I think, you know, none of the producers, none of the people involved in the editing of that, none of them would have said, hold on a second, have we cast the net wide enough here? You know, you've hit the nail on the head. That's, you know, that's what the red wall looks like. And no, there are a whole load of fascinating questions to be asked, aren't there, about, as you said, about shifting demography, about where the left, where the appeal of the left lies, who its core vote is now, and how that might have changed, and what the left should do about that. But what I think again and again, and this happens with academics like Goodwin, they have a very narrow sense of how politics works. I actually think, although they wouldn't admit to this, I actually think they have a kind of list of rules. Here are the rules to win an election. Here are the things that you have to do. Here are the things you mustn't talk about. And I just find it extraordinarily narrowing and limiting. And I think it has a really profound impact on our politics.
They do. I mean, they absolutely do. I mean, as you know, I almost started a PhD looking at leaders of the opposition. And part of the reason why I just couldn't get anywhere with it was that, apart from one article I read about Corbyn as leader of the opposition, which was coming from a slightly left-wing perspective, that there was, I wouldn't say there's no evidence, but what there's a tendency to do, even in the academic literature, is to go, here's some examples of politicians doing the sorts of things that we like, and therefore, like moving to the centre ground, detoxifying the party, etc., etc., etc. And of course, I think prior to 2017, you can probably sustain that view fairly convincingly, and therefore, you can sort of get away with it until that point. But once 2017 happens, you've got to re-examine that and sort of ask the question, well, if that's true, all of those things that you sort of move to the centre ground, you detoxify the party, and you don't win elections by energising left voters, you win them by appealing to conservative voters who didn't vote for you the last election. If all of that stuff's true, well, what happened in 2017? And, so I think re-examining that is really interesting. And, I think it's an open question, however, whether a future Labour platform that seeks to energise the left would be the right thing to do, because there are lots of examples where that doesn't work. I think it's something like William Hague in 2001, where his strategy is, well, let's bang on about keeping the pound and see if that can win as an election. He picks up one seat. So I think, there's no right answer to this. But when you look at 2017, you've got to come to the conclusion that, building up a political movement matters, energizing people who didn't vote last time matters, energizing young people matters increasingly in our politics now. And, and also, as we've talked about before, each election is unique. So what was true about 2017 was that it was possible in 2017 for Labour to neutralise the issue of Brexit to some extent, which is why Theresa May's strategy failed, whereas in 2019 it wasn't. And therefore, because you could neutralise it, you could talk about underlying issues that really resonated with people. And the Labour campaign in that election was superb, for the many, not the few, really clear messaging. And yet, if you're on the right of the Labour Party, there's no learning to be done from that election. Now, obviously, we lost, right? Before, I don't know, this probably won't end up on YouTube, but before anybody watches this video, before I get comments on YouTube going, you lost the election, I'm aware of that, but it points to another way forward. It points to another strategy. And of course, a future left-wing leader might not have all of the disadvantages that Jeremy Corbyn had. Yeah.
I think it's worth saying, how surprising the 2017 election result was, and I would, it's very easy for me to remember exactly how surprising it was, because I told everybody who would listen that the Labour Party was on course for, sub 30%. It was going to be an embarrassment, and that was even as I've talked about how wedded I was to a certain way of seeing politics. Even with the clear direction the campaign was going in, I still thought Theresa May was going to ultimately win a fairly comfortable majority. And I think that got memory hold afterwards. I think everybody, if you talk to people now, they say, oh, Theresa May's campaign was disastrous. Of course, I think if my memory of the campaign was that yes, the gap was narrowing, but people on election day still expected Theresa May to win a majority. That the fact that it was a hung parliament was shocking. It's the best, in terms of vote share, it's the best performance by a leader of the opposition in the UK in the 21st century. No other leader of the opposition has achieved 40% share of the vote. And when you consider that the Labour Party had collapsed in Scotland 2 years earlier, you know, it's a really extraordinary result. And one of the things that I think is striking, and you've studied the election more than I have.
I'm just checking that claim you just made is true.
Yeah, please do. I'm happy for you to back.
Are you sure Blair didn't in 1997?
Well, as I said, in the 21st century.
Oh, in the 21st century.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, obviously I'm not. Yeah.
Well, that sort of narrows it down to like 20 years. It sounded like a really extraordinary claim. now the penny has dropped.
I think if you said to people who's the most credible leader of the opposition of recent times, people would say, well, obviously David Cameron was more prime ministerial than. Well, David Cameron won what, 35%?
Point something.
Yeah, people would say, oh well, obviously Ed Miliband, you know, had his weaknesses, but you know, still more prime ministerial than Jeremy Corbyn. You know, he did worse than Jeremy Corbyn in vote share even 2019.
But that points to another underlying factor that people miss. It's very clear in the to be fair to the Labour Party in their analysis after the 2019 election, one of the big long-term factors is, you know, because this didn't just happen overnight. This, you know, that's the other mistake you can make. You can look at 2019 and go, short-term factors, let's just look at them. Let's just look at the fact that Jeremy Corbyn was uniquely unpopular, and there was a valid charge of anti-Semitism and the way he dealt with it, and the manifesto was.
I would quibble. I would quibble with the first part of that. I don't think it's valid to accuse Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism, but I do think.
No, I'm not accusing him of anti-Semitism. I'm accusing him of not dealing with it.
I think that's
anywhere near as well as he needed to. And the manifesto being too radical and people not believing that it was deliverable. So those are all the short-term factors. But what gets missed in that analysis is that the Conservative vote share had risen at every election since 1997, and therefore and you could look back further than that, and you could say, well, since 1997, the Labour Party have been losing their core vote, and so those long-term factors get missed by people who want to look at this isolated 2019 election as being sort of uniquely bad, which it was. You know, it was uniquely bad in the sense that Labour got their worst results since 1931, right? So they were uniquely bad in that sense, very, very bad. But it wasn't uniquely bad simply because of short-term factors. It was bad because short-term factors, long-term factors, and of course Brexit creates this huge sort of like, steam train through any analysis that you want to do in terms of it being, you know, if you wanted to pick an election that you can't analyze. In fact, let's talk about two elections. If you wanted to pick two elections that are difficult to analyze in terms of simplistic narratives about the election, you'd probably pick the two that people do pick to discredit the left, 1983 and 2019, because in both cases you've got these huge extraneous variables. In the case of 2019, Brexit, hello, and in 1983, the split of the Labour Party, the emergence of the STP. Well, how do you analyse that? It's totally unknown in British politics to have a third party that gets like 25% of the vote. So is that your election that you're going to keep going back to discredit the left? It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, sorry, I've gone off on one there, but.
No, I think there's lots in there, and I think if we go back briefly to 2017, the point I was going to make there was that actually as you've sort of spelled out, I think what the Labour Party did do in that campaign was essentially it did sort of follow some of the rules of politics. You know, it did have a nice clear message. You know, it did have very strong kind of grassroots base in terms of getting the word out, getting the vote out, and it contrasted with the kind of like stuffy pessimism of Theresa May. It had this very clear, optimistic, positive vision of what the future would look like. And I do still think that serves as a sort of touchstone for what a Labour political campaign should look like. And I think it's important that we hang on to as I say, just how unexpected all of that was. Because, yeah, as you say, two years later, the Labour Party suffers, massive reversal of fortune. And what I remember about that, sort of two things really. One, I remember the sort of absolute devastation the next day, just really recognizing that, almost as what I would call it kind of patriotic devastation, in the sense that I felt a sense of grim foreboding about what it meant to have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister for 5 years. I watched the campaign carefully. It's clear to me that he had no regard for basic truth, any willingness to face up to reality or the responsibilities of his role, or the hard choices that he would face in delivering Brexit, which are now becoming much more apparent. Certainly someone who wouldn't be able to respond to the potential crises that being Prime Minister throws up, obviously became critically apparent 3 or 4 months later. But the other thing I remember about the next day was this huge sense of relief from the commentators of the centre and the centre left. Like, oh, phew, now we can just go back to saying all the things we said before. Now, okay, there we go. Right, the 2017, yeah, it was a glitch. Like, Theresa made really bad campaign, uniquely bad. Corbyn still didn't win. Now we can prove that in fact, we can consign that to the dustbin of history. That was absolutely the mood of a large sort of chunk of centrist political opinion, and what I would just come back to, and what I think is critical, because you've talked about these recent elections, and you've drawn parallels, for example, with the 2019 or this kind of Labour purity on the left, this left-wing purity, perhaps in parallel to William Hague and a kind of a right-wing core vote strategy, put it like that. I think the difference that's missed there is the sense of like where we're at historically. And that, I think, is the really profound thing that needs to be grasped by people, is that post 2008 and certainly post Brexit referendum 2016, I think that was a playing out of the the forces that have been unleashed by the financial crash. That political orthodoxy that you and I have described, that we were brought up in, that we at one point were very much thought within, that has just collapsed. And I think it really has collapsed. I don't see the 2019 result as any limitation on that view. It's still the fact that a Prime Minister like Boris Johnson can win power, can pursue a political agenda that's so obviously destructive as Brexit is, be cheered on by a large section of the press. Those are truly kind of morbid symptoms of a consensus that has been stretched past breaking point. So I don't see it as, should the left pursue a core vote strategy? Should it try and win over kind of, alienated conservatives? I think you win a future election by breaking with the consensus that has already broken.
Yeah.
And you offer something that is very clearly new.
And Hague's interesting, right? So if you think about Hague, well, I sort of ridiculed him a bit for banging the drum of Europe. But if you saw that as part of a broader project, it succeeded, right? So maybe Hague back in 2001 was onto something, because what do we have now? We've got a coalition that's put together because of this issue of Europe, that taps into a certain perspective on Britain, its place in history, and therefore where Britain should be located in the world relative to Europe, but also in other ways. And as I've just said, the Conservative vote went up all the way through that period. You had the emergence of the UK Independence Party. So what did the right do successfully that actually Cameron didn't? They built a movement, and they were able to galvanise that into an actual majority for the first time in British politics since Baldwin in the 1930s. The last time a governing party got over 50% of the vote, the Brexit referendum, you could say it's the second time since the first time since then that any question in the affirmative gets over 50% support in the country. So, you know, maybe you could see that as a lesson for the left. Maybe, dare I say it, maybe you could look at Nigel Farage and learn some lessons about how to build support. Now, of course, the problem for the left is that what we don't have is the Daily Mail and the Daily Express and the News of the World at the time, and the Telegraph and the Times on our side, which is something we will talk about another time. I think it would be possibly a natural endpoint to end there. We've covered quite a lot today. Probably stuff I didn't I didn't intend to talk about.
Wasn't on the list.
But let's end it there. So in future sessions we will talk about this some more, I imagine, and other things.